Hello, my name is Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Umber Studios. Welcome to another online drawing session. This session mimics the structure of a regular life drawing class. We'll show you one or more photographs on the screen and it's your job to draw what you see. We'll have an artist joining us, doing a demonstration and giving hints and tips. You can either follow their advice or do your own thing. It is entirely up to you. Once the session is finished, don't forget to post your work onto Instagram and hashtag it with #RawUmberLive. You can also download the reference photographs and watch this video again after the session is finished. So if the artist is going too fast for you, don't worry. You can watch the video now and then watch it again later on. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to this latest raw umber portrait tutorial. In this tutorial I will be drawing a single 1 hour pose, and for this I'll be using white paper as well as willow charcoal. Now I'll be using willow charcoal for most of the video, but later on I may switch to compressed charcoal pencil, and I particularly like the General's charcoal pencil. You can see I'm using 6B, which is extra soft, which makes it easier to erase. To blend I'll be using a range of blending tools. This can be a brush, a stump or a tissue or your finger. It can be whatever you prefer to use. And finally, I like to use a grey putty rubber because it's nice and easy to knead into precise shapes. Now all of the materials can be found in the materials box below the video with links to the shop where you can buy the exact same stuff that I'm using. But of course, feel free to use whatever material you prefer. Now today I'll be drawing a single 1 hour pose, and the first thing I'm going to look for is the center line, which is a line that goes all the way from the middle of the forehead down the middle of the chin. Now note when I'm drawing this that I'm not using my wrist. Instead I'm using my whole arm to draw, and I only use a little bit of pressure. Now if I use my charcoal like I would a pen, you can see that the marks get a lot darker. And of course that's very useful for the details, but not very useful for the beginning stages. So I hold it at the end and I try to keep my wrist stiff and instead use my whole arm to draw. The next thing I'm going to do is place the top and the bottom of the skull on my paper where I want it in terms of the composition. Now I use something called comparative measurement for all of my videos, and what this means is that I can find, for instance, the midpoint of the skull on the drawing and then compare this to the midpoint on the picture. Now in this case, and in most cases if you have a straight on head, the eyes will be the middle of the skull. And note that this should always be a 90-degree angle from the center line, so the eyes are perpendicular to that center line no matter which way the head is turned. Now for this video I want to take you through some common used measurement, and the next favorite measurement I like to use are the 3/3 of the head. And these are bottom of the chin to bottom of the nose, equal to bottom of the nose to top of the brow, and top of the brow to the top of the forehead or the top of the skull. Now as you can see, comparative measurement is really useful because it allows us to compare our drawing to the picture in front of us. And this way we can make it as big or as small as we like, as long as the relative proportions are still the same. Now up until now I've only measured verticals, but I can also compare verticals to horizontals, for instance. A really useful measurement for this is taking the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin and comparing this to the middle of the nose to the outside of the cheekbone. And in most people they will be more or less equal. And this is very useful because of course it gives us the general proportions of the head. Now of course these measurements that I've given you are very generalized and not very specific to the model. And so I can adjust these to adjust to his likeness. In his case, for instance, I can see that the brow line is actually lower than the first 1/3. So he's got a higher forehead compared to the rest of his features. Now this can really lead to some fairly generic drawings, and so just for the purpose of this exercise I want to talk about line, especially straight lines, and how they can help you develop your eye in order to see these curves a bit better. So for instance, if I look at a cheekbone and follow the hairline towards the top, I can simplify this into one straight line. And a good way to see in which direction this straight line goes is comparing it to the vertical center line. So for instance, in this case we can see that the line goes to roughly 1 o'clock. Now I can do the same thing with the jawline, and of course there's lots of curves going on there. So I'm going to try and simplify that first into 2 straight lines on each side. And when I do this, I can see that I can drop a line down, almost vertical, from the cheekbone to about halfway between the nose and the bottom of the chin. Let it go inwards to the flat of the middle of the chin. So as you can see, like this, we still get a feeling of curves. But we're also training our eye to see these curves a bit more accurately. And this can really help with finding the likeness and making your drawings feel more realistic. Now if you'd like to make this into a full curve, all you need to do is just gently round off the very edges, and suddenly you have a very nice calculated curved line. Now I'm going to hold off on that. Again, just for the purpose of the exercise, I want to really focus on straight lines and how far I can push this. Now something that's fairly important in drawing are shadow shapes. And this is because it shows that the drawing is 3D. There are some parts that go towards the light and some parts that are obscured and are not getting any light. And a really good example of this is the side plane of the head. Now if we look at this cheekbone, we can see on the right hand side it is in shadow. And I'm going to try and simplify this using only 2 lines. First, I can measure from the center line how many times that shadow shape fits. And I can see it's about 1/3 of the total space. Now from there, all I need to do is look at the general angle and then simplify this using a straight line. Now of course this side plane is also the same on the other side, but on the other side we can see it's actually indicated with a highlight. Now I am going to draw this in later, but for now I'm just making a light mark to indicate I know where that side plane is, because it will help me find the features of the face. Now coming back to this technique of using straight lines, right next to this main plane we've put in, we can see a little triangle of light below his eye and in between his nose and his cheekbone. Now this triangle is very useful and it's called the Rembrandt triangle because he loved using it in his portraits. And I can just try and look at this as a little triangle of light and just try to follow the angles and the measurements of the lines using this straight line technique. Now working this way, we are basically simplifying the portrait, which is very complicated, into a series of shapes using these straight lines. And this means that instead of drawing the cheekbone, all we need to do is draw this zigzaggy triangle of light. And that just makes it so much easier to draw a portrait. Now I'm just going to spend a bit of time just darkening some of the shadows around it to make it easier for you to see this. So now we can really see that light triangle. And you can think of a portrait or any drawing as a series of light shapes and dark shapes, and we can look at how they interlink. So for instance, next to this light shape I can see another dark shape, which is the shadow on the side of the nose. And I'm going to try and draw this in using straight lines, just like I did for the cheekbone. Now the eye sockets are fairly complicated, so I like to just start by glazing them in with a bit of charcoal, just figuring out the top versus the bottom, and then maybe leaving out a little triangle for the bridge of the nose. And as you can see, I'm keeping my straight lines fairly simple at the start, only using 2 or 3 per shape. And then later I will introduce more and more lines in order to make it more accurate. But at this stage I'm just looking at where everything sort of fits together. For instance, for the hairline, I can see that it takes up about 1/3 of the top of his skull, and then I can use straight lines to figure out the general shape of his hair. Now with hair it can be very tempting to straight away get caught up in all of the different textures and shapes, but I try to just look at where the hair is more voluminous and where it's less voluminous and close to the skull. And this way I get a general sense of how the hair sits on him, which again can be another piece of the puzzle with solving this problem of a portrait drawing. And while I'm doing this, if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments if you're watching this live. Now, another really useful way to help you find accuracy in your lines is seeing where they intersect. Now, for instance, if I follow the line of the shoulder, I can see that it points to the tip of the nose, and this is where it intersects with that another line of the other shoulder. So at this stage, I'm still working from big to small, but I've got most of my biggest shapes in. And now we can start looking at, let's say, the medium shapes. And one of these shapes, of course, is the mouth. Now when working on the mouth, I like to look at comparative measurements, and I can see that the little shape underneath his lower lip is about halfway down the tip of his nose. To find the start of his upper lip, I can divide that same space into 3 equal thirds, with the first line being the shape of his upper lip. So I'm just using the same principles as I explained at the start of the video, but now on a much smaller scale. I'm still looking at dark shapes versus light shapes, and I like to squint at the drawing if I find it difficult to see these dark shapes, because of course around the features and around the mouth there's quite a lot of beard going on, which can make it harder to see these shapes. Now when shading, since this is a video on lines, I like to use horizontal lines to indicate atmosphere. So anywhere where I don't particularly want the viewer to look, I will use equally spaced horizontal lines. You can see that when I do this, that I'm lifting my charcoal after each stroke. And this just makes for a neater look of the drawing, and it also gives you more control. Now I may blend on top of this using my stump in this case, but these lines still shine through and indicate something to the viewer. Now I will get more into different lines for different purposes, but first let's continue to find some of these smaller shapes. Now the nose is another area that has lots of little shapes, and I'm sort of working my way up here. So the first thing I'm going to look for is the tip of the nose. And again, using straight lines for this. And then I'm going to find the little square shape of the nostril. Then there's also the bridge of the nose, which is more of a long shape, narrowing into the tip of the nose, which is more of a diamond shape. And lastly, I can connect the outside of the nostrils. Now I've got these landmarks, I can look at how the little shadow shapes move across, and I can make my generalized straight lines into even smaller pieces. So for instance, around the top lip, I can see there's a diagonal followed by a horizontal, and then another diagonal as it goes towards the bottom of the cheek. Now at this stage I like to join my shadow shapes together, because this just makes it a bit easier to see all the different shapes, and it gives a sense of unity to the drawing. Now the last feature I'm going to work on are the eyes, and I purposely chose to do this last because I'm now a little bit more warmed up. I can see the shapes a bit better, and the eyes are the most complicated of all the features. Now the first biggest shape I'm going to find is the inside of the brow to the corner of the eye. That's a nice big block of a dark shape. And once I've got this big shape for the brow, I know where the corners of the eye should be, and I can use my straight lines to find the light shape, which is the top lid. And of course the iris is also quite a big shape. And you can see that I'm just using a generic shape for this at first. Again, working big to small, using straight lines. And then later I will break this down even further. Now the same thing on the other side, making sure that the corners of the eyes are aligned. I can start looking for the triangle of the dark shape of the brow. Next, I can look for the second largest shape, which is the shape of the iris. And I'm going to try and make sure that it's more or less in line with the other eye. So now I've got most of the features in. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on the ears because I haven't really done anything on those yet. And what I like to do when I'm drawing is spend a little bit of time here, then make sure that other bits are also caught up, and then return to the bit I was working on. And for the ears, I can see that they line up with the corners of the eye and the middle of the mouth. And the reason I jump around to drawing like this is that it's very easy to spend a lot of time on, let's say, the eyes and then forget about the rest of the drawing altogether. And this, of course, will end in having a few floating eyes and not have completed any of the rest of the face. And it also helps me to see the bigger shapes first, which allows me to build up the portrait slowly. And the final thing, and this is the main reason why I love working like this, is that it gives me a fresh eye. So every time I switch focus, I can see something else that needs to be changed. Whereas if I work on the same area continuously, my eye gets used to the mistakes I may have made and I stop seeing what I need to change. So switching around is a really good way to train your eye to see these shapes and lines more accurately. Now at this stage of the drawing, I've got a more or less accurate sort of block-in of the portrait. And you can see why it's called a block-in, because I've only been using straight lines and big blocks of shapes. And this is a good time to start getting out my compressed charcoal and start working a little bit more with lines. Now I can use this compressed charcoal to start looking at even smaller lines. For instance, on the nostril here, I'm just breaking down my sort of medium precise lines with even more precision. Now something that's really useful and also kind of hard about the compressed charcoal is that it's very hard to erase. So try to keep very light pressure for this. Now we can use this to our advantage, because if I go over the outlines of some of these shadows, I can then use a blending tool to blend this into some of the lights without losing my precise shapes. And as you can see, I can then go back in and adjust again. So it's a really nice way to go back and forth on a drawing and slowly add more detail while still softening at the same time. Now you may have noticed that I'm mostly working on the outlines of my shapes and I'm not really adding a lot of detail inside the lights or inside the shadows. And this is for a very good reason. It's because most of the textures can be described using the edge of the shapes. And what I mean by this is that if I, for instance, use vertical lines following the hairs around the shape of the upper lip, we start getting a sense of hair around that area. So you can see I'm using small vertical strokes following the hair, and then I can blend this in later on. So as I was talking about earlier, I like to use horizontal lines to indicate the atmosphere and lines that follow the form to indicate the direction. Now, for hair, the direction is all over the place. But for instance, the mouth itself, I can follow the direction of the lips in order to enhance that feeling of the direction of the form. And this is a really nice way to get different textures. So for instance, the bottom of the nose has some bits that I will use to follow the form because this is a shadow on skin. And then there's other bits where I can use lines that follow the hairs in order to indicate again that this is a part of the drawing that is connected to the beard. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the eyes. I'm using my compressed charcoal to really find the shapes. And then blending this into the paper once I've really worked out where the line should be. And something that's really nice about this blending is that it shows you where the shape is not sufficient. So if I have quite a blended eye, I can really see where I need to start adding some of my straight lines. And because now I have a nice fresh eye, I find it much easier to see the shapes. But again, I'm doing a lot of squinting to help me see the dark versus the light shapes. For instance, I can see that when I squint, the iris disappears into the white of the eye on the right hand side near the cheekbone. And then on top of this, I can add the shape of the iris on top. And then, just like I did on the beard, I can then use some directional lines to indicate the hairs of his brow. And this will contrast nicely with the more straight lines that follow the form of the eyes. So you can think of lines like this. You have either lines that go across the form, like for instance the hair lines that I've been making, or you have lines that follow along the form. And lines that follow along the form indicate harshness or direction, and lines that follow across the form indicate softness. Now comes the hardest bit, and that's matching up the other eye, because of course we need to make sure that this is symmetrical. So the first thing I look for is the inner corner of the eye. Next I can make the bigger shape of the inside of the brow a little bit more specific. And I can start looking at the shape of the top lid. Now I want both eyes to be the same size, so again I'm comparing the top across with the other eye to make sure that they're both roughly the same. Then another sphere for the iris, making sure that this one is roughly the same shape and size as the other one. And then again blending this all together. So I really like working this way, looking for small straight lines, slowly breaking down my shapes. And when it feels a bit too harsh, I just blend it together, and because the compressed charcoal stays and doesn't easily move like Willow does, it allows it to look a little bit more natural without losing the shapes altogether. Alright, so I'm going to switch focus again, and now I'm going to look at everything that's not the features. Now of course the features are the most difficult, and so we spend the most time on them, but the rest of the face is also important. And the first thing I'm going to look at is the cheekbone. And again, I'm going to follow lines across that cheekbone to indicate that it is a round shape. For areas that aren't as important, for instance, the side plane of the head and the ear, I can use horizontal lines again to indicate atmosphere, making sure that I lift up my charcoal after each stroke to make it look a little bit more neat. Now if you're worried about losing the jawline or the ear, feel free to use the compressed charcoal to just draw over these lines to make sure that you won't lose them when we're blending this in later. Now once I've done this, I can blend it together again. And if I need to, I can keep building up like this, adding horizontals, then blending it, then adding horizontals again. And this gives a really nice atmosphere to the drawing that feels very controlled. Now again, looking at the forehead, if I lightly trace with my willow charcoal, you can see that the forehead should be going round. And so I'm going to try and make these lines follow the shape and the form of the forehead to indicate the softness there. Now where I see the skull a bit more clearly, I can use a directional line that follows the form to indicate the bone there. So I'm going to try and finish this drawing this way, either looking for directional lines that follow the form, or lines that go across the form to indicate texture or softness, and horizontal lines to indicate atmosphere. And hopefully all of these different types of lines will work together to create a dynamic portrait. For instance, the chin will need to have some texture to indicate the beard, so I'm going across the form there, trying to vary my lines to indicate the roughness of the hair. Now the instinct may be to start drawing all the different hairs in the light shape as well. But I find that this can look very harsh and not actually that realistic. So I tend to leave these out. Instead, I'm gonna continue focusing on the edge between light and shadow. Now I haven't really done anything on the ears, and I do this on purpose because it's one of those things that can be very fiddly to draw. So I'm going to leave the shadow side of the ear alone, and I'm just going to indicate some of the main planes of the ear in the light. Now I do have an ear only video, so if you're a subscriber, feel free to have a look at that video if you'd like to get more into the ears. Now for the hair, again, we want to not have to focus on that area. So I'm using a lot of horizontal atmospheric lines, and then maybe I will add a few directional lines to indicate some of the shape of the hair. But we still want to keep the detail in the hair a lot less compared to the detail in the rest of the face. Now for the areas in the focus point, for instance the eye, I can start pulling out some darker lines, maybe pulling out some highlights as well, in order to give more variety of line in the areas that I do want the viewer to look. So for instance, I'm now darkening some of the outlines in the eye, and I'm blending this in by using my atmospheric lines to join this all up. So as you can see, I'm now using those horizontal lines together with my blending tool to work the detail back into the shadow. And this is because if I wouldn't do this, it would really feel rather broken up. And so I'm adding variety by adding detail, and then I'm finding the unity back by working it back into those shadows. So there's always a bit of a back and forth here in the finishing process of the drawing. And of course, finally, we can add some highlights. I'm just using the rubber for this. And I always do this last because it can be a really tempting thing to do. And then it can be hard to draw around the highlights. So I often just put it in very softly, then draw a little bit more again and putting in a little bit more highlights. I'm slowly building up that highlight rather than plopping it in at the start of the drawing. Now, as we're nearing the end of the pose, I'm going to continue varying my line quality like this. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to let me know here in the comments. And otherwise, I will speak to you near the end of the pose. Alright, so that's the end of the post for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you feel like you've learned something about using line as a way to suggest texture and form. Now, if you'd like to show us your work, feel free to use the photograph button right here in the chat. Or if you prefer, you can use the hashtag #RawUmberLive if you use Instagram. Now finally, if you enjoyed this video and you feel like you've learned a lot from it, consider joining us for a subscription. We do these videos twice a week, Wednesdays for the figure, Sundays for the portrait, and I try to vary the theme. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It's always nice to see some regulars on the videos.
I hope you enjoyed the session and thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your works onto Instagram and hashtag them with #RawUmberLive. We run 2 sessions a week, a figure drawing session every Wednesday at 8 PM and portrait drawing every Sunday at 4 PM. The last portrait session of every month is free. Thank you and goodbye.